Imagine this, a country, when trading, exports so much more than it imports, yet still it has a poor economic condition. That must be sad. In this video, we are going to be looking at current accounts. Hi friends, welcome to Econverse. I'm Abrar and I'm a fellow student who topped in my GCSE Economics exam last year in Oman. On this channel, we make learning economics simpler, clearer, and hopefully a lot more fun. In this video, let's look at current accounts. Let's get straight into it. Okay, so in this video, we are going to be looking at the current account of the balance of payments. So let's actually start with the basics. Firstly, your balance of payments. What does that even mean? A balance of payments is essentially a record of all the economic transitions between the residents of a country and the rest of the world in a particular period of time. So, a balance of payment is something that's maintained by the National Income Accounting Department in foreign currency that it basically reflects a record of all the economic transactions, that is all of the exports, all of the imports, all of your remittances, etc., going from the residents of your country to the rest of the world and coming from the rest of the world to your country over a period of time. I hope that makes sense. So now actually the balance of payments is split into three main accounts. So you have something called the capital account, you have something called the financial account, and you have something called the current account. So as for the GCSE spec, we would be only looking at the current account. So the current account is actually the most volatile. It is the one that changes, that fluctuates the most. So now let's get straight into it. So another important thing to understand is the balance of payments has a very, very critical aspect here. Individually, each of the accounts can be in deficit or surplus. However, the overall balance of payments has to balance with a zero, a deficit, or a surplus. If the balance of payment doesn't balance over two successive quarters, if that means if it doesn't equate to zero, if the balance of payments between both the countries, or like the countries and the rest of the world, doesn't equal for two successive quarters, the whole year it will not recover. Also, if within the next 2 quarters the country doesn't get the loans or financial aid in order to match up, in order to patch the economy up to match for the deficit in the current account and the balance of payment, the country doesn't, it would be a failed state. The country becomes something called a failed state. For example, Sri Lanka in 2019. So now let's begin by zooming in on the current account. We have now gotten like a broad overview of what the balance of payments is and how it works. So when we look at the current account, it is split into 4 main things. So you have something called the balance in trade of goods. Then you have your balance in your trade of services. Then you have primary income, and lastly you have your secondary income. So these are the 4 main segments of the current account that we're going to be looking at. So let's first understand what each of these even mean. So balance in the trade of goods basically means the goods are tangible products, services are intangible products. So this is invisible trade and this is visible trade, if that makes sense. And then we have the interesting factors. We have something called primary income and we have something called secondary income. So primary income basically means, if you remember from our diagram of the circular flow of income, you have something called factors of production and you have factor incomes which are paid for each factor of production. So the primary income basically measures the net factor income, if that makes sense. So it measures the factor income that is received from other countries, subtracting the factor income that is paid to the other countries. Secondary income includes transfer payments. Now, transfer payments refer to money that is being paid with no exchange of goods and services. Now, examples of transfer payments could be stuff like state provisions are a good example. Then you have remittances as well. So these are two. Remittances is when you send money back home. This is quite common if you are someone who lives abroad and have family back at home. You have remittances, which is when you send money back home. So now let us understand the most important part of this whole chapter. Now the balance of the four components sum up to give the current account balance, if that makes sense. So when you add all of these up, when you add every single thing up, you get the balance of your current account. And this is one of the most key factors of your overall balance of payments. Now the two main words or the two main formulas as of such you could say to remember is when your current account is in surplus, remember the word surplus, and your current account is in deficit. These are the two main scenarios. So your current account surplus is when credit is larger than debit. Debit is the amount of money that goes out and credit is the amount of money that comes in. Whereas when you have a deficit, you have your debit which is greater than your credit in the economy. So now let us look at the causes and the consequences of each of these surplus and deficits. So let's begin with surplus. So whenever you have a current account surplus, it is usually caused due to a couple of reasons. Again, now I'd suggest that you make your list. Number one, you have a low exchange rate. As you know, when you have a low exchange rate, which you could remember like I do as WPIDEC. I mean, that sounds really complicated, but it's really simple. A weaker pound imports dearer and exports cheaper. So when you, let's say in this you're assuming that your home currency is the pound, the exports are cheaper to other countries, so they become more competitive, and thus you have more exports than imports, ceteris paribus. Then we have high quality as one of the causes, high quality of domestic products that are being sold. Again, so this stimulates the demand for your exports. Then you have high income. Then third reason is you have high income abroad as one of your reasons, and then you have low costs of production, you have high levels of investment from foreign, like from foreign. So this is called foreign direct investment, which we look at in A level in much depth rather than in GCSE. For now, you just need to know you have more investment in the economy. And then you have receive a lot of remittances. Now that is just an additional reason. So basically, whenever you have a surplus, the causes are usually completely positive. It's as simple as that. That's how I remember it. Just think of every single positive thing that could happen in the economy which can improve your export-import situation. That's how I think of it. So I think in economics it's important that you feel the concept, that you understand the concept for you to really get the lists inside rather than sit and memorize them. Now let us look at some of the consequences of a surplus in your current account. Now, whenever you have a surplus in your current account, you have economic growth. Why is this? Because as you know, aggregate demand has one key component called net exports, exports minus imports. And in this, when you have more exports than imports, aggregate demand increases. Then you have appreciation of your currency. So your currency grows stronger in value. Then you have employment. You have more people that are being employed as labor is derived demand. You have better standard of living. So essentially every single positive thing possible. Then you also do have something which is slightly risky, although it's good if it is up to a certain level, but beyond a particular point it becomes really harmful, and that is inflation. So these are the main consequences of a current account surplus. Majorly really positive stuff, however, except inflation. Now let us look at a current account deficit situation. So now we're going to be looking at deficit. So let's again begin with the causes of it first. So one of the main, now let's try and think in the opposite scenarios for a deficit. Now in the first one, for surplus, we assumed that when you have a low exchange rate, you have a surplus. So for deficit, it's the exact opposite. When you have a high exchange rate, you are at risk of a deficit because of the acronym in this case being SPICED, which means the stronger pound imports cheaper and exports dearer. Now your exports have become really expensive, so they are less competitive, and thus you have more imports than exports, ceteris paribus, and that worsens your current account. Then you have another reason for your current account deficit being higher economic growth. This might sound confusing, but it's actually quite simple. So whenever you have high economic growth, you might import factors of production. So thus you can have current account deficits. Then you do have decline in competitiveness as one of the factors. Decline in competitiveness in your international market, as we looked at in the example of SPICED. So whenever you become less competitive, your exports decrease, your imports increase, and thus the balance of payments worsens. Then you have inflation as one of the factors, because whenever you have high levels of inflation domestically, your prices of products when exported increase and thus lose competitiveness again. Then you have to assume that in that case we assume that there is high income abroad. So in this you have to assume the exact opposite. You assume there's recessions abroad. So whenever you have recessions in other countries, people's income are lower and thus they will not be willing to import as well. So your country's exports suffer. And then you can also argue that there's a current account deficit when there's high borrowing. So these are the main causes of current account deficits. So in this case, I would suggest you to look at everything from a negative point of view. Whenever you look at everything going wrong in the economy, there's a current account deficit. That's how I would think of it. So now let us go through some consequences. So some consequences of a current account deficit would be, firstly, you would have a fall in economic growth. You would have unemployment. Every single negative way, like every single negative thing that could happen. Then you basically have to argue for everything in the opposite direction. You can argue for low standard of living. You could also argue for high borrowing, which could potentially damage the economy. You can argue for low investment, capital outflow. You don't have as much investment in the economy. So now we have looked at the consequences of both of them and the causes of both of them. So now lastly, the main thing that we need to look at is policies. So the policies surrounding current account deficits and surpluses. So whenever you have measures to correct a current account deficit, would be firstly having contractionary fiscal policies. So whenever you have contractionary fiscal policies, you are essentially reducing your demand for imports, and then you can argue for contractionary monetary. So contract your demand, and lastly, you could also argue for protectionism in order to reduce your country's imports. So these could be done in the case of a deficit. Then let us look at it in now for surplus. You can argue for expand demand side. I'm just basically like writing that shorter. So basically expansionary monetary and fiscal policies and removing protectionism. Now you could also argue for something that we look at in a future video, which would be for deficit, it would be a floating exchange rate, and for surplus as well, it would be a floating exchange rate. Now we'll look at that in one of our future videos. So that is all for current accounts for now. If you think this video helped you understand economics better, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Econverse. I'll see you again in the next video where we discuss trade.